Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Imagine a city built where no city should exist, rising from salt marshes and shifting sands between two unpredictable rivers. A place where the summer sun could kill, where floods could erase a year's labour in a single night, where the very earth contained more salt than soil. This inhospitable land, this geographic impossibility, would become Babylon, the jewel of the ancient world, the centre of human civilization for over 2,000 years. Here, in perhaps the least likely spot on Earth, humanity would invent writing, codify law, map the stars, and build gardens that defied nature itself. Tonight, we will journey through the millennia to walk the streets of this legendary city, from its humble beginnings as a minor Akkadian town to its transformation into the greatest metropolis the world had ever seen. We will stand before the brilliant blue tiles of the Ishtar Gate, witness the construction of the Tower of Babel, and decode the mysterious writing that appeared on a palace wall to herald an empire's doom. Our exploration will reveal how a city that should never have survived instead gave us the very foundations of modern civilization, from the 60 minutes in our hours to the idea that justice should be written down for all to see. I'd appreciate it if you could spare a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It would help me tremendously. These small gestures make a real difference in keeping this content coming. I'm always amazed by how far-reaching these videos are, so please let me know in the comments where and when you're tuning in. Close your eyes and let your breathing deepen as we drift together into the heat and dust of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers snake through an endless expanse of reeds and mud brick. The year is 1792 BC, and a young king named Hammurabi has just inherited a small city-state surrounded by more powerful neighbours. The air smells of river clay and burning bitumen, of baking bread and animal dung, of the sharp sweetness of date wine, and the metallic tang of bronze being hammered in 100 workshops. You can hear the calls of merchants speaking in a dozen different tongues, the creak of wooden wheels on stone roads, the splash of water being drawn from the canals that crisscross the city like veins. This is Babylon at the moment, before its transformation, when it was still just another Mesopotamian city baking under the relentless sun, unaware that it would soon reshape the destiny of human civilization forever. Part 1. Origins from Adversity. Between two rivers. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was never meant to cradle civilization. Unlike the predictable flooding of Egypt's Nile, which arrived each year like a gentle gift, the twin rivers of Mesopotamia behaved like wild beasts, sometimes withholding their waters until crops withered into dust, other times raging across the plains to sweep away entire villages. The soil itself fought against human ambition, thick with salts that poisoned fields after just a few seasons of irrigation. Summer temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to crack mud bricks and drive even lizards into shade. Winter brought bitter winds from the northern mountains and rains that turned the whole world into an ocean of mud. Yet it was precisely this hostility that forged the world's first civilization. The Sumerians, who first settled these lands around 4500 BC, learned that survival demanded cooperation on a scale humanity had never before attempted. Individual farmers could not dig the vast canal networks needed to channel floodwaters or drain salt from fields. Single families could not maintain the levees that protected settlements from destruction. The brutal environment forced humans to organize, to create hierarchies of authority, to develop writing systems, to track the labor and resources needed for massive public works. Where the land was kindest, humans could afford to remain in small, independent communities. Where nature was cruelest, we were forced to become civilized. The first permanent settlement at Babylon appeared around 2300 BC, though it was merely a small Akkadian administrative centre called Babili, meaning Gate of God. For centuries it remained, overshadowed by greater cities like Uruk, and Eridu to the south. The site held one crucial advantage that would eventually elevate it above all rivals: its position at the narrowest point between the two rivers, just 35 miles apart. Every merchant travelling between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean had to pass this way. Every army moving between the Iranian plateau and the Levantine coast crossed here. The gods, it seemed, had placed their gate at the exact centre of the known world, though it would take nearly 600 years for mortals to recognize this divine geometry. The tower that touched heaven. Long before Babylon rose to greatness, its people told stories of a tower that scraped the belly of heaven itself. The structure they spoke of was the great ziggurat Etemenanke, the foundation of heaven and earth, though its origins reach back into the mists of prehistory, when the first mud brick was laid upon another in defiance of the flat earth. Each generation of kings added to its height, competing with their ancestors to come closer to the dwelling places of the gods. By the time Hammurabi inherited Babylon in 1792 BC, the ziggurat had already been built and rebuilt 7 times, each iteration grander than the last. Each collapse teaching the builders new lessons about the limits of mud and bitumen. You stand at the base of this monument on a morning in 1770 BC, your neck craning backward until it aches, trying to glimpse the shrine at its peak. The structure rises in 7 terraces, each painted a different colour: white, black, purple, blue, vermilion, silver, and at the crown, gold that blazes. Like a second Sunday, priests in white linen climb the 300 steps that wind around its exterior, their forms growing smaller and smaller until they seem like insects against the vast artificial mountain. The air here smells of frankincense and myrrh, offerings burning eternally in bronze braziers. You feel the ground beneath your feet vibrate slightly, thousands of tons of brick settling and adjusting with changes in temperature and moisture. Local workers whisper that the tower sways in strong winds, that sometimes at night you can hear it groaning like a living thing, speaking in a language older than human speech. Hammurabi understood that whoever controlled this tower controlled more than just a religious monument. The ziggurat was the axis mundi, the pole around which the entire cosmos revolved. Peasants from 100 miles away could see it rising from the plain like a finger pointing toward heaven. Traders navigating the rivers used it as a landmark. The tower proclaimed that here, at Babylon, earth and heaven met. When Hammurabi began his campaigns to unite all of Mesopotamia, he did not just promise military protection or economic prosperity. He promised that all people would share in Babylon's special relationship with the divine, that they would become citizens of the city where gods and humans conversed. The tower was both his greatest propaganda tool and his genuine religious conviction. Every brick added to its height was an act of faith that Babylon was destined to rule not just Mesopotamia, but the entire world beneath the dome of heaven. Part 2. Foundational Innovations. The Code, written in stone. Before Hammurabi, justice was a whisper that changed with every telling. A man who stole grain in one city might lose his hand. In another, he might pay a fine. In a third, he might become a slave to his victim. The powerful bent laws like reeds in the wind, while the poor found that justice had as many faces as there were judges to dispense it. Hammurabi recognized that an empire built on such shifting foundations would crack and crumble. Between 1755 and 1750 BC, he assembled the greatest legal minds of Babylon to create something revolutionary: a single code of law that would apply to every person in his realm, carved into stone so that no scribe's error or noble's whim could alter it. The moment of the code's unveiling in 1750 BC transformed the marketplace of Babylon into a theatre of divine justice. The great black basalt stele, nearly 8 feet tall, was positioned where the morning sun would illuminate its 500 lines of cuneiform text. Crowds pressed forward, merchants abandoning their stalls, mothers lifting children onto their shoulders. At the top of the stone, carved in exquisite detail, Hammurabi stood before Shamash, the god of justice, receiving the laws directly from divine hands. The message was unmistakable. These were not the arbitrary rules of a mortal king, but the will of heaven itself. A scribe read aloud, in a voice that carried across the square, "If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If he breaks another man's bone, his bone shall be broken." The crowd murmured. The wealthy shifted uneasily. The poor stood a little straighter. The code addressed everything from murder to medical malpractice, from inheritance to irrigation disputes, creating a comprehensive framework for urban life. that would influence legal systems for the next 4,000 years. It established the radical principle that punishment should fit the crime, that there should be different penalties for crimes against free men versus slaves, that accusers must provide evidence. Most revolutionary of all, it was public. Any literate person could read what the law demanded. Even the illiterate could hire a scribe to read it to them. The code standing in Babylon's center meant that for the first time in human history, power had to answer to written rules that everyone could see. Kings after Hammurabi might ignore the code, might create their own laws, but they could never erase the idea that justice should be carved in stone, permanent and visible, rather than whispered in palace chambers. The mathematics of the stars. The Babylonian astronomers who climbed the ziggurat each night after 1600 BC were not searching for beauty in the heavens, but for patterns that could predict the future. They believed the gods wrote their will across the sky and the movements of planets and the phases of the moon. To decode these divine messages required mathematics of unprecedented sophistication. Where other civilizations counted in tens, perhaps because humans have 10 fingers, the Babylonians chose 60 as their base number. 60 could be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making complex calculations possible without fractions. This choice, made 3,000 years before Christ, is why you check a watch with 60 minutes in each hour and navigate with 360 degrees in a circle. On a clear winter night in 1500 BC, you climb the exterior stairs of a minor ziggurat, following an elderly astronomer whose apprentice you have become. Your legs burn from the ascent, and the cold wind cuts through your woolen robes. At the observation platform, bronze instruments gleam in the moonlight. Astrolabes, sundials, water clocks that measure the passage of night hours. The astronomer shows you clay tablets covered in columns of numbers, each representing the position of Venus over the past 63 years. See here, he says, his finger tracing the cuneiform. The goddess Ishtar's star disappears for exactly 3 days, then rises as a morning star for 263 days, vanishes for 7 days, and returns as an evening star for 263 days. You realize with a shiver that these numbers mean the astronomers can predict where Venus will be, not just tomorrow, but decades from now. They have stolen a secret from the gods themselves. The mathematical innovations born from these observations revolutionized human thought far beyond astronomy. Babylonian mathematicians developed the first place value number system, where a symbol's position determines its value, making it possible to write any number with just a few characters. They calculated square roots and cube roots, solved quadratic equations, and discovered what Greek mathematicians would later call the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They created the first ephemerides, tables that predicted lunar eclipses and planetary positions centuries in advance. When Greek astronomers, like Hipparchus and Ptolemy, later built their models of the cosmos, they relied entirely on Babylonian observations and calculations. Every time a navigator plots a course, an engineer measures an angle, or a student solves for X, they used tools forged in Babylon's temple towers by priests who believed mathematics was the language of heaven. Clay tablets and eternal words. In the tablet houses of Babylon, young scribes spent 12 years learning to press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay, transforming human thought into something that could outlast flesh and bone. The cuneiform writing system, refined by 1750 BC into a flexible tool capable of capturing everything from epic poetry to grocery lists, required mastery of over 600 distinct signs. Some symbols represented whole words, others syllables, still others grammatical concepts that had no spoken equivalent. The complexity was intentional, literacy was power, and those who controlled writing controlled civilization itself. The daily work of a scribe in 1700 BC began before dawn, in rooms that smelled perpetually of wet clay and sesame oil from the lamps. Your fingers would already be stained black from yesterday's inkwork on papyrus imports from Egypt, but most of your day dealt with humbler materials. You take a lump of clean clay, kneading it like bread until it reaches the perfect consistency, neither too wet nor too dry. The stylus, A simple reed cut at an angle becomes an extension of your hand. Each stroke must be precise. Too deep and the clay cracks. Too shallow and the mark will not survive the firing. You copy a contract for the sale of date palms, recording not just the price and parties but witnesses, curses upon anyone who breaks the agreement, and blessings for those who honour it. Every seventh tablet you make is a duplicate, one for each party and one for the temple archives, because Babylonians understood that even fired clay could break, that rivers could flood, that fires could consume, but somewhere, in some archive, the words would survive. This obsession with preservation gave us the oldest literary works in human existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, already ancient by Hammurabi's time, was copied and recopied by generations of scribes, each adding marginalia, corrections, and variant readings like a centuries-long scholarly conversation. Mathematical texts, preserved theorems, and problems for students 2,000 years in the future. Medical tablets describe symptoms and cures, creating humanity's first diagnostic manuals. Most remarkably, Babylonian scribes wrote detailed colophons, the ancient equivalent of metadata, recording who wrote each tablet, when, where, and sometimes even why. One touching colophon from 1650 BC reads, "Written by the hand of Bel-Ushazib, junior scribe, in the tablet house of Babylon, in the month of Ayaru, copied from an ancient tablet whose lines were damaged. May Nabu, god of writing, forgive my errors." In that admission of imperfection lies something profoundly human. The knowledge that despite our flaws, the attempt to preserve wisdom for future generations is itself sacred. Today, when archaeologists unearth these tablets, they can still read the hopes, fears, and dreams of people who died 4,000 years ago, their thoughts preserved in fired clay more permanently than any monument of stone. Part 3. Early Growth and Consolidation. The Merchant Princes of the Desert Routes. After Hammurabi's death in 1750 BC, Babylon might have faded into obscurity like so many Mesopotamian cities before it. But the merchant families understood something the warriors and priests did not. True power flowed along trade routes like water through irrigation channels. By 1600 BC, these trading dynasties had woven a web of commercial connections that stretched from the lapis lazuli mines of Afghanistan to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the tin deposits of Anatolia to the incense groves of Arabia. They created the world's first international economy, and Babylon sat at its heart, like a spider feeling every vibration along the golden threads. The great merchant houses bore names that echoed through marketplaces across the known world. The Ajibi family, the Murashu, the Aya Iluta Bani. Their sons learned accounting before they learned poetry, studying clay tablets that showed compound interest calculations and currency exchange rates between silver shekels, copper talents, and barley measures. In their courtyard counting houses, where the clicking of abacus beads provided a constant percussion beneath the calls of traders, they developed revolutionary financial instruments. Letters of credit meant a merchant no longer needed to carry gold across bandit-infested wastes. Written contracts for future delivery created the first commodity markets. Investment partnerships, called haranu, let multiple traders share both the risks and rewards of long-distance expeditions. One surviving tablet from 1595 BC shows a contract where 12 investors pooled resources to fund a caravan to the tin markets of Ashur, agreeing to split profits according to their contributions, with additional shares for the agent who would spend 2 years on the road. The arrival of a major caravan in Babylon was theatre and economics combined. Dust clouds announced them hours before they reached the city walls. Guards on the towers would count the camels, sometimes 500 in a single train, and runners would carry the news to the merchant quarters. By the time the caravan entered through the trade gate, the entire commercial district had erupted into controlled chaos. You push through crowds of buyers, examining bolts of purple cloth from Tyre, the dye so expensive that only royalty could afford entire garments of that colour. The air fills with a dozen languages haggling simultaneously: Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, Kassite, Aramaic, each trader calculating values in their own currency, while scribes frantically record transactions on wet clay. The smells assault and entice in equal measure: cinnamon bark from India, myrrh from Somalia, rotting leather from water skins, fresh bread from vendors feeding the crowds, and everywhere the distinctive musk of camels who have crossed 1,000 miles of desert. Night falls, but the trading continues by torchlight, because everyone knows that by dawn the caravan will depart again, carrying Babylonian textiles, metalwork, and most importantly, sealed tablets that are promises of payment, contracts for future trade, and letters of introduction to distant partners. The merchants of Babylon had discovered that information and trust could travel farther than any physical goods. That reputation was the ultimate currency. Gardens for a homesick queen. The story begins with tears in the palace of Babylon, though whether those tears truly fell remains one of history's great mysteries. Around 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II, the young king who would transform Babylon into the ancient world's greatest metropolis, married Amytis, a princess from the mountainous kingdom of Media. The chronicles tell us she was beautiful, intelligent, and desperately homesick for the green hills and flowing streams of her childhood. Babylon, flat as a tablet and brown as its bricks, was slowly killing her spirit. What Nebuchadnezzar did next would become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though not a single stone of it survives today. The king summoned architects and engineers from every corner of his empire, presenting them with an impossible challenge: build a mountain in a land without stones, create forests where rain falls only 4 inches a year, make rivers flow upward against the will of nature itself. The solution they designed defied every law of architecture known to the ancient world. They began by constructing massive, vaulted terraces, each one smaller than the one below, rising in a pyramid of planted platforms that would reach 75 feet into the sky. The vaults, made from fired brick and sealed with bitumen to prevent water damage, had to be strong enough to support not just soil, but full-grown trees, some with roots that sought to penetrate 30 feet deep. The foundation walls, discovered by archaeologists to be 22 feet thick, suggest the enormous forces they were designed to withstand. You are a hydraulic engineer from the northern provinces, recruited for your knowledge of mountain irrigation systems, standing at the base of the construction site in 595 BC. The scale makes you dizzy. Workers swarm like ants across wooden scaffolding that seems to reach the clouds. The innovation that will make this wonder possible is being installed today: a chain pump system, powered by slaves, walking in giant wheels, lifting water from the Euphrates through bronze pipes, hidden within the massive supporting columns. As you watch the first test, water begins to gurgle and splash, defying gravity to emerge at the highest terrace. From there, it will flow down through the gardens in a series of streams and waterfalls, the sound of running water filling the queen's chambers with memories of home. The smell of wet earth, so rare in Babylon, begins to perfume the air. Within 3 years, the hanging gardens had transformed from architectural audacity into living paradise. Date palms and pomegranates provided shade on the lower terraces. Cedar and cypress, transported as saplings from Lebanon and Iran, grew on the middle levels. At the crown, alpine flowers from Media bloomed impossibly in the Mesopotamian heat, sustained by the constant mist from fountains that caught the light in tiny rainbows. Birds that had never been seen in Babylon began nesting in this aerial forest. At night, lanterns placed throughout the gardens made them glow like a constellation that had fallen to earth. Whether Amytis's tears stopped, we cannot know, for she vanishes from historical record after the garden's completion. But Nebuchadnezzar had proven something more important than his love: that Babylon could reshape reality itself, that in this city, even the impossible was merely another engineering challenge waiting to be solved. Part 4. Golden Age, Peak Power. The Gate of Gods. In 575 BC, as travellers approached Babylon from the north, they encountered a sight that made even veteran merchants stop their caravans in wonder. The Ishtar Gate rose 47 feet above the plain, its surface blazing with such brilliant blue that it seemed as if a piece of the heavens had been brought to earth and given geometric form. This was not paint but glazed brick, thousands upon thousands of lapis lazuli tiles that caught and threw back the sun in ways that seemed to make the entire structure pulse with divine light. Upon this field of cosmic blue, 575 bulls and dragons, fashioned from golden and white bricks, stood in proud procession, each one representing the power of the gods made manifest in Babylon's walls. The technique required to create these glazed bricks pushed Babylonian craftsmen to the very limits of their skill. Each brick had to be molded, carved with portions of the larger design, painted with mineral glazes, and fired at precisely controlled temperatures. Too hot and the glaze would bubble and crack. Too cool and the colours would remain dull and lifeless. The blue came from copper, the white from tin, the gold from antimony, each requiring different firing temperatures. Master craftsmen developed a revolutionary technique of multiple firings, applying different glazes at different stages, creating depth and luminosity that flat paint could never achieve. A single dragon required over 100 individually crafted bricks, each one numbered on its back to show its exact position in the larger design. When archaeologists reconstructed portions of the gate 500 years later, they found these ancient assembly instructions still legible, a testament to Babylonian organizational genius. But the Ishtar Gate was merely the beginning of a journey designed to humble visitors before they ever reached the palace. Beyond it stretched the processional way, a corridor half a mile long and 73 feet wide, its walls rising 36 feet on either side, creating a canyon of glazed brick. Here, 120 lions, symbols of Ishtar herself, seemed to stride alongside anyone walking toward the city centre. Each lion was unique, some roaring, others prowling, their muscles rendered with such anatomical precision that they seemed ready to leap from the walls. The acoustic design of this artificial canyon was deliberate, sounds echoed and amplified, so that religious processions, accompanied by drums and horns, would fill the space with thunder that could be heard throughout the city. The psychological effect was calculated and overwhelming. By the time visitors reached the palace, they had walked for 15 minutes between walls that proclaimed Babylon's wealth, power, and divine favour. No one who passed through the Ishtar Gate ever forgot that they had entered not just a city, but the dwelling place of gods on earth. The king who ate grass. The Book of Daniel preserves a strange and terrible story that Babylonian court records seem to confirm through their suspicious silence. For 7 years, between 573 and 566 BC, the greatest king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire vanished from official documents. No royal inscriptions, no building projects, no military campaigns. When Nebuchadnezzar II finally reappeared in the historical record, he was changed, speaking of a divine humbling that had taught him the limits of mortal power. The Greeks, writing centuries later, would call his affliction lycanthropy, the delusion that one has become an animal. The Babylonians, in rare clay tablets that survived the official censors, whispered of the time when their king lived like a beast in his own gardens. You are a palace guard, sworn to secrecy on pain of death, watching the king from a discreet distance in the royal garden compound in 571 BC. The man who once made foreign kings prostrate themselves now crawls on all fours through the morning dew, his hair grown wild and matted, his nails so long they curve like talons. He pulls grass from the earth and chews it methodically, his vacant eyes reflecting no recognition of the golden palace visible through the trees. His body, once soft from palace luxury, has become lean and sinewy from living outdoors. The physicians whisper among themselves, debating whether this is divine punishment or mortal illness. Some speak of a fever that struck after the king boasted that he had built Babylon by his own power, without crediting the gods. Others mention the increasing pressures of maintaining an empire, the sleepless nights, the paranoia that led him to trust no one, not even his own reflection in polished bronze. The queen and crown prince maintain the fiction that Nebuchadnezzar was in religious seclusion, letting no foreign ambassadors near the palace gardens. State business continued under the queen's seal, always with the formula, by the will of the great king. The hanging gardens, built for love, became a luxurious asylum. Servants left food and fresh clothing at designated spots, collecting them untouched days later. Sometimes, in the early morning, courtiers would hear howling from the gardens, a sound that made even hardened soldiers touch their protective amulets. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the madness broke. One morning in 566 BC, guards found Nebuchadnezzar standing upright at the garden's edge, calling for a razor and clean robes. His first coherent words were recorded on a tablet that survives today. I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High. Whether divine intervention, natural recovery, or ancient medicine had restored him, the king who returned to the throne was fundamentally changed. His remaining years showed a humility previously unknown, his inscriptions always crediting the gods for Babylon's glory. The man who had eaten grass like an ox had learned what few absolute rulers ever discover, that even the mightiest human is only one fever, one delusion, one divine whim away from crawling in the dust. 1,000 tongues, one city. By 560 BC, Babylon had become the ancient world's first truly cosmopolitan metropolis, where a morning walk through the market meant hearing languages from 3 continents. The city's population had swelled to over 200 souls, making it the largest city on earth. Entire quarters were devoted to different ethnic communities. The Judean exiles in their district near the Kaaba Canal, the Egyptian merchants near the southern harbour, the Greek mercenaries in barracks by the western wall, the Indian spice traders with their distinctive white turbans and strange vegetarian customs. Each group brought their gods, their customs, their cuisines, creating a cultural kaleidoscope that no previous city had ever achieved. The neighbourhood, known as the Street of the Translators, embodied this polyglot reality. Here, professional interpreters maintained offices in narrow buildings, their services essential for everything, from international trade to marriage contracts between people who shared no common language. A surviving tablet from 558 BC lists the rates for translation services. 2 shekels for a simple letter, 10 for a legal document, 50 for simultaneous interpretation at important negotiations. The most successful translators knew 5 or 6 languages fluently and could get by in a dozen more. They were not mere conduits for words but cultural interpreters, explaining why certain gestures offended Egyptians but amused Greeks, why Indians refused to eat meat on certain days, why Jews would not conduct business on their Sabbath. The fusion of cultures created innovations that would have been impossible in a more homogeneous city. Babylonian astronomers learned of the zero from Indian mathematicians, a concept that revolutionized their calculations. Greek philosophers debated with Babylonian priests, creating new schools of thought that would later influence Plato and Aristotle. Jewish scribes, maintaining their religious texts in exile, absorbed Babylonian literary techniques that would shape the final form of the Hebrew Bible. The cuisine of the city became legendary for its fusion of flavors: Syrian bread, stuffed with Indian spiced lentils, beer flavored with Egyptian herbs, fish prepared with Persian techniques and Arabian spices. One feast menu preserved on a clay tablet lists dishes from 14 different culinary traditions served at a single banquet. 5. This diversity was not without tension. Fights broke out between Greek mercenaries and Persian guards, between Jewish monotheists and Babylonian polytheists. The city authorities developed sophisticated systems for managing conflict, including separate court systems for different communities and a complex schedule, ensuring that various religious festivals did not overlap in ways that might cause friction. Yet most remarkably, the city worked. People who would have been mortal enemies in their homelands became neighbours, business partners, even friends in Babylon's crowded streets. The city proved that humanity's greatest achievements come not from purity, but from mixture, not from isolation, but from exchange. The House of All Knowledge. Deep within Nebuchadnezzar's palace complex stood a building that contained more human knowledge than any structure before it, the Great Library of Babylon. By 550 BC, it housed over 30 cuneiform tablets, a collection that represented the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. The library was not a single room, but a complex of chambers, each devoted to different subjects and levels of secrecy. The outer rooms contained agricultural manuals and basic mathematical texts. The inner sanctums held the secrets of divination, the true names of gods, and medical knowledge that could kill as easily as cure. The acquisition of texts for the library was a state obsession that rivaled military conquest in importance. Royal agents travelled to the edges of the known world with unlimited funds to purchase or copy important works. When negotiating peace treaties, Babylon often demanded not gold or territory, but access to royal archives. Pirates, who captured ships carrying texts, were offered pardons if they surrendered the documents intact. A letter from 553 BC shows a librarian writing to the king about acquiring a complete set of Assyrian medical texts. "My lord, the tablets you desired from Nineveh have been located. The price is extraordinary, 500 gold shekels, but they contain treatments for the falling sickness unknown in Babylon. I await your divine decision." The king's response was simple: buy them. Send armed guards for the transport. The organization of this vast collection represented humanity's first attempt at systematic knowledge classification. Head librarian Nebuchadnezzar II developed a cataloguing system that would not be equaled until the Library of Alexandria 5 centuries later. Tablets were organized first by subject, then by subcategory, then chronologically. Each had a tag attached with string through a hole in the tablet, listing its contents, author, and location. Finding aids, essentially ancient card catalogues, helped scholars locate specific information across thousands of texts. The library employed over 100 scribes who did nothing but create copies, ensuring that knowledge would survive flood, fire, or war. They developed specialized scripts for different purposes: large, clear letters for texts meant to be read aloud, tiny compressed script for archival copies, and elaborate ceremonial scripts for religious works. The scribes also acted as editors, comparing multiple versions of texts, noting variations, and sometimes adding commentary that preserved scholarly debates across centuries. Festivals of the New Year. For 11 days each spring, Babylon transformed into a theatre of cosmic renewal during the Akitu festival, the New Year celebration that reaffirmed the sacred order of the universe. The festival, beginning on the first new moon after the spring equinox, was not merely a religious spectacle but a carefully choreographed ritual that involved every inhabitant of the city, from the king to the humblest slave. For those 11 days, normal life ceased. Courts closed, businesses shuttered, and even wars were suspended, as the entire city participated in humanity's oldest recorded religious drama. On the fourth day of Akitu, in 555 BC, you stand among hundreds of thousands lining the processional way as dawn breaks over Babylon. The air thrums with anticipation and the sound of drums that have been beating since midnight. Incense burns from 1,000 braziers, creating a haze that makes the morning sun appear blood red. Then, from the Ishtar Gate, the procession emerges. First come the priests in white linen, carrying standards topped with the symbols of every god in the Babylonian pantheon. Behind them, slaves pull wheeled platforms bearing the cult statues of the gods themselves, dressed in real clothing and jewelry worth more than entire cities. But all eyes are on the central wagon, carrying Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, his statue covered in so much gold that it requires 20 men to pull it. The king's role in Akitu was both supreme and humiliating. On the 5th day, in a ceremony witnessed by the high priests, Nebuchadnezzar II would enter Marduk's sanctuary alone. There, the high priest would strip him of his royal regalia, slap his face hard enough to bring tears, and force him to kneel while declaring his innocence of any sins against the city. Only after this ritual humiliation would his kingship be renewed for another year. The symbolism was clear. Even the most powerful mortal was nothing before the gods, and his authority existed only at divine pleasure. This ceremony of royal humbling, performed annually for over 1,000 years, provided a safety valve for popular resentment and reminded kings that their power had limits. The climax came on the 10th day, when the entire population gathered outside the city for the sacred marriage, a ritual that ensured fertility for the coming year. The king, playing the role of the god Dumuzi, and a high priestess representing Inanna, would disappear into a specially constructed reed hut. What happened inside was known only to them, but when they emerged, the crowd would erupt in celebration that continued until dawn. The final day saw the gods return to their temples, the king to his palace, and the people to their normal lives. But something had been renewed. The cosmic order had been reaffirmed, the social hierarchy validated, and the relationship between Babylon and the divine restored. For another year, the center would hold. Part 5. Seeds of Decline. The Writing on the Wall. On the night of October 12, 539 BC, Prince Belshazzar threw the last great party of the ancient world. His father, King Nabonidus, had fled to the Arabian desert months earlier as Persian armies surrounded Babylon, leaving his son to defend the indefensible. But the city's walls were 40 feet thick, its granaries full, and the Euphrates flowed through its center, providing unlimited water. Babylon had endured sieges for years without falling, so Belshazzar decided to demonstrate his confidence with a feast that would be remembered until the end of time, though not for the reasons he intended. The great throne room blazed with the light of 1,000 oil lamps, their flames reflecting off golden plates and silver goblets looted from the Temple of Jerusalem decades earlier. Over 1,000 nobles reclined on silk cushions, their faces flushed with wine from the royal cellars, wine that should have lasted years, being consumed in a single night. Musicians played increasingly frantic melodies on harps and flutes, competing with the laughter and shouting that echoed off the painted ceiling. The air grew thick with incense smoke, roasted meat, and the sweet stench of wine spilled on Persian carpets. Belshazzar himself, dressed in purple robes that cost more than a village, stood swaying on the royal dais, raising the sacred vessels of the Hebrew god in a mocking toast to the idols of Babylon. At that precise moment, the music stopped. The laughter died. Every eye in the room turned to the wall behind the throne, where something impossible was happening. A hand, just a hand with no body attached, appeared from the air itself and began writing on the plaster wall with a finger that glowed like burning bronze. The letters formed were in Aramaic, the common tongue of the empire, but the words made no sense. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upfarsin. Belshazzar's wine cup fell from nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like breaking bones. His knees knocked together so violently that his royal robes shook. The mighty prince who had defied the Persian Empire was reduced to a terrified child by 4 mysterious words. The palace scholars were summoned, but none could interpret the writing. Finally, the Queen Mother remembered Daniel, the Jewish exile who had interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. The old prophet was brought before the trembling prince, and his interpretation was as harsh as truth itself. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Even as Daniel spoke, Persian soldiers were wading through the Euphrates riverbed. Cyrus the Great's engineers had diverted the river upstream, lowering the water level just enough for troops to pass under Babylon's river gates. By dawn, Belshazzar was dead, his blood mixing with the wine on the throne room floor. The city that had stood for 2,000 years fell without a battle, conquered not by siege engines or battering rams, but by the arrogance of a prince who used sacred vessels as wine cups. The writing on the wall had been both warning and judgment, and like all divine messages, it was understood only when it was too late to change the outcome. Rivers that changed their course. Long before Persian soldiers exploited the Euphrates to conquer Babylon, the river itself had been slowly murdering the city it had created. The Euphrates was not a stable waterway, but a writhing serpent of silt and water that changed its course by miles every few centuries. By 550 BC, the river had begun one of these gradual migrations, shifting its main channel westward at a rate invisible to human perception, but devastating in its accumulated effect. The elaborate canal system that had made Babylon the agricultural jewel of Mesopotamia was failing. Channels that had carried water for 1,000 years were running dry. Fields that had produced barley since before written history began, turning white with salt. You are a canal inspector in 545 BC, walking the ancient waterway that your great-grandfather helped maintain, your father after him, and now you, but something is terribly wrong. The measuring rod you carry, marked with the expected water levels for this time of year, shows the canal is running at barely half capacity. You have already walked 5 miles from the main river channel, and everywhere you see the same signs of slow catastrophe. Date palms along the banks are dying, their fronds brown and brittle. The small villages that depend on this canal for irrigation have abandoned their outer fields. concentrating their efforts on the few acres closest to the diminishing water. The smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation fills your nostrils. Most disturbing of all, you can see salt crystallizing on the soil surface like a white plague, rendering the land poisonous to any crop. The Babylonian engineers understood what was happening but were powerless to stop it. They could dig new canals to reach the shifting river, but each mile of new construction meant more water lost to evaporation and seepage. They could build higher levees to force water into the old channels, but this only accelerated the river's determination to find a new path. The mathematics were implacable. Maintaining the agricultural system that fed 200 people in Babylon required exponentially increasing amounts of labour as the river moved away. A clay tablet from 542 BC records the desperate measures being considered. Let every man in the city, from age 15 to 50, provide 30 days of canal labour each year. Let the temples surrender their gold to hire foreign workers. Let us pray to Ea, Lord of the deep waters, to return the river to its ancient bed. The ecological crisis created a cascading series of social and political failures. As agricultural yields declined, food prices soared. Smaller cities that had accepted Babylonian rule in exchange for irrigation engineering began to question the value of that bargain. The merchant families, seeing the writing not on walls but in their ledgers, started moving their operations to other cities. The temple priests, whose wealth came from vast agricultural estates, found themselves unable to maintain the elaborate festivals that legitimized royal power. When Cyrus offered to respect local customs and reduce taxes, many Babylonians saw Persian rule not as conquest, but as rescue from an impossible situation. The greatest irony was that Babylon, the city that had first mastered the control of water, would ultimately be defeated by water's refusal to be controlled. The Euphrates, which had given birth to civilization between its banks, was slowly carrying that civilization away, one grain of silt at a time. Part 6. Transformation and Collapse. The Persian at the Gates. Cyrus the Great entered Babylon on October 29, 539 BC. Not as a conqueror but as a liberator, his soldiers carrying green branches of peace rather than drawn swords. The Persian king had crafted his invasion as meticulously as any military campaign, but his weapons were propaganda and promises rather than siege engines. For months before his arrival, his agents had spread through Babylonian territory, carrying clay cylinders inscribed with a revolutionary message. Cyrus came not to destroy but to restore, not to impose Persian gods, but to honour all deities, not to loot, but to lower taxes. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered by archaeologists in 1879, preserves his exact words: "I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer, and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world." The contrast with Babylon's recent rulers could not have been starker. Where Nabonidus had neglected Marduk's festivals to worship the moon god Sin, Cyrus immediately ordered the restoration of all traditional ceremonies. Where Belshazzar had used temple treasures for drunken parties, Cyrus returned confiscated religious artifacts to their sanctuaries. Most brilliantly, he presented himself not as a foreign invader, but as Marduk's chosen instrument, claiming the god of Babylon had searched through all lands for a righteous ruler and selected him. The priests, who had grown to despise Nabonidus for his religious innovations, welcomed this narrative. When Cyrus entered the city, they lined the processional way not as conquered subjects, but as grateful hosts, welcoming their divinely appointed king. You stand among the crowd on that October morning, unsure whether to feel relief or shame, as the Persian army marches through the Ishtar Gate. These soldiers are different from any you have seen. Their armour is scales of bronze that shimmer like fish skin, their horses larger and better fed than Babylonian mounts, their faces bearing the composed confidence of men who have conquered half the world. But they do not loot, they do not rape. They buy food in the markets at fair prices, paying in good silver. Their king, when he appears, is surprisingly small, with intelligent eyes and a greying beard, riding not a war chariot but a simple horse, stopping frequently to accept petitions from common people. When he reaches the temple of Marduk, he dismounts and walks barefoot up the steps, performing the proper rituals as if he had been born to them. The Babylonian crowd, which had stood in suspicious silence, begins to cheer, first tentatively, then with genuine enthusiasm. The genius of Cyrus lay in understanding that empires built on tolerance last longer than those built on terror. He allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, earning the only designation of Messiah ever given to a non-Jew in the Hebrew Bible. He permitted Babylon to maintain its laws, its language, its customs, even its local governors, asking only for tribute and military support. The city prospered under Persian rule, becoming the winter capital of an empire, stretching from India to Greece. But something essential had been lost. Babylon was no longer the center of its own story, but a chapter in someone else's epic. The last independent king of Babylon had died drunk on the floor of his throne room, and with him died 2,000 years of Mesopotamian self-determination. Alexander's last breath. Alexander the Great entered Babylon in 331 BC through the same Ishtar Gate that had admitted Cyrus 2 centuries earlier. But where the Persian had come with promises of continuity, the Macedonian came with dreams of transformation. At 25, having conquered the largest empire the world had ever known, Alexander saw in Babylon not a relic to be preserved, but a foundation for something unprecedented, a world capital that would fuse Greek, Persian, and Babylonian civilization into something entirely new. The city, which had been slowly declining under later Persian rule, suddenly found itself at the center of the ancient world's most ambitious experiment in cultural synthesis. The scale of Alexander's plans for Babylon defied even Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions. He ordered the complete reconstruction of Etemenanke, the great ziggurat that had partially collapsed, but with Hellenistic architectural improvements, including a Greek-style theatre built into its base. He commanded the construction of a harbour large enough for 1,000 warships, though Babylon lay 500 miles from the nearest sea, planning to connect it via a massive canal that would make the city the naval headquarters for his planned Arabian campaign. Most audaciously, he initiated the marriage of East and West, a literal wedding ceremony where 0 of his Greek and Macedonian soldiers married Asian women in a single day, with Alexander himself taking 2 Persian princesses as brides. The weddings took place in a pavilion so vast, it took 600 talents of gold just for the decorations. On the evening of June 10, 323 BC, after a day spent reviewing architectural plans for Babylon's expansion, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by his admiral Nearchus. The palace where they feasted was the same throne room where Belshazzar had seen the writing on the wall, though Alexander, who collected omens like some men collected art, either did not know or did not care about this dark precedent. The young king drank deeply of the strong Babylonian beer, so different from the wine of Macedonia, laughing at crude jokes told in 4 languages, planning campaigns that would take him to the gates of Rome and the shores of Britain. Near dawn, he complained of a sudden pain in his chest, a fire burning behind his ribs. Within hours, fever consumed him. For 10 days, the man who had never lost a battle fought his final campaign against an invisible enemy, possibly typhoid, possibly poison, possibly the accumulated exhaustion of a decade of constant warfare. As Alexander lay dying in the same palace where Hammurabi had written his laws and Nebuchadnezzar had ruled the world, his generals asked to whom he left his empire. His response, whispered through fever-cracked lips, was either to the strongest or to Craterus, but the ambiguity hardly mattered. The moment he stopped breathing on June 11, 323 BC, his empire began tearing itself apart. Babylon became a prize, fought over by his successors, changing hands 6 times in 20 years, each conquest stripping away more of its remaining wealth and population. The city that Alexander had chosen to be the eternal capital of a unified world instead became the site where the dream of universal empire died with the dreamer. Sand over splendor. The death of Babylon was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow forgetting that stretched across centuries. By 141 BC, when the Parthians took control, the city's population had shrunk to fewer than 50 souls. By the time of Christ, it was perhaps 10. When the Roman Emperor Trajan visited in 116 AD, he found only ruins and jackals. The greatest city of the ancient world did not fall to conquest or catastrophe, but to the most implacable enemy of all, irrelevance. Trade routes shifted, rivers changed course, new cities rose, and Babylon, which had been everything, became nothing. The physical dissolution proceeded with agonizing thoroughness. Without constant maintenance, the elaborate canal system that had sustained the city for 2 millennia became a network of stagnant pools, breeding malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The great ziggurat at Etemenanke, already damaged by centuries of neglect, became a quarry for local villagers who needed bricks for their huts. They would burn the ancient tablets they found in the rubble, not knowing they were destroying astronomical observations and literary masterpieces, because the clay made excellent lime for mortar. The hanging gardens, deprived of slaves to work the chain pumps, dried and crumbled, their exotic plants withering in the Mesopotamian heat they had never been meant to endure. Within a generation of the water stopping, nothing remained but terraces of dead earth and the hollow columns that had once carried rivers into the sky. You are a shepherd in 450 AD, grazing your flock where the processional way once echoed with the footsteps of kings. The sheep pick their way between broken walls that rise from the earth like broken teeth. Your grandfather told stories of when these ruins still had names, when he could identify the palace, the temples, the great gates. But to you, they are simply convenient shelters from sandstorms, their original purposes as mysterious as the cuneiform inscriptions that cover fallen stones. Sometimes you find things in the sand. A piece of lapis lazuli that might have decorated the Ishtar Gate, a clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped marks that mean nothing to you, a bronze spear point that might have belonged to one of Alexander's soldiers. You sell these to passing merchants for a few copper coins, not knowing you are selling fragments of humanity's first great civilization. The sand was patient and thorough. It filled the throne rooms where empires had been proclaimed and destroyed. It buried the libraries, where the movements of planets had first been predicted. It covered the law courts, where Hammurabi's code had been read aloud for centuries. Each year, the wind brought more, and each year, fewer people remembered what lay beneath. By the time medieval Arab geographers tried to locate Babylon, they could only point to various mounds in the Iraqi desert and shrug. The city that had touched heaven was now indistinguishable from the earth that had reclaimed it. Local legends spoke of a cursed place where jinn lived in the ruins, and strange lights appeared at night, where the ground itself was poisoned with salt and sorrow. They were not entirely wrong. The salination that had begun 2,000 years earlier had reached its conclusion. Nothing would grow where Babylon had stood. The land itself had become a monument to mortality, proof that even the greatest human achievements are only temporary defiances of entropy. Part 7. Legacy and Modern Traces. Echoes in our hours and minutes. Every time you glance at your watch, you commune with Babylonian astronomers who have been dead for 4,000 years. The 12 hours on the clock face, the 60 minutes in each hour, the 60 seconds in each minute, all preserve the sexagesimal mathematics developed in ziggurat observatories when most of humanity had not yet learned to count past 20. This is not metaphor but literal inheritance. When you mark an angle as 360 degrees, you use a Babylonian innovation. When you navigate by latitude and longitude, you employ their system of dividing circles. The invisible architecture of time and space that structures modern life was built in Babylon. The influence runs deeper than numbers. The 7-day week that governs work and worship across the globe originated in Babylonian astronomy, with each day named for one of the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye: the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. Though the names changed as the concept spread, the structure remained. Sunday and Monday still openly declare their celestial patrons, while Saturday preserves Saturn, even in English. The weekend itself, that blessed pause in labour, echoes the Babylonian belief that the 7th day was unlucky for work, a day when the gods rested, and mortals should avoid important undertakings. When modern workers thank God it's Friday, they unknowingly participate in a rhythm of time established when iron was still a miracle metal. The zodiac that millions consult in daily newspapers, though filtered through Greek and Roman interpretations, preserves Babylonian star patterns identified before 1500 BC. Scorpio, Leo, Taurus, These are translations of Babylonian constellations that priest astronomers used to track the sun's annual journey. The very concept that celestial bodies influence human destiny, the foundation of astrology, emerged from Babylonian observations that certain planetary alignments coincided with floods, droughts, and political upheavals. They were wrong about causation but right about correlation, inadvertently discovering cycles in solar activity and climatic patterns that modern science would not identify until the 20th century. Even the word disaster, literally meaning bad star, preserves their worldview in our vocabulary. Most remarkably, Babylon gave us the idea that justice should be consistent and written. Before Hammurabi's code, law was whatever the strong decided. After it, even kings had to pretend their judgments followed established precedents. Every legal system that publishes its statutes, every court that considers prior rulings, every citizen who demands to know what law they are accused of breaking, follows a precedent carved in black basalt in 1750 BC. The American Constitution, the Napoleonic Code, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all are distant descendants of the radical Babylonian notion that law should be literally set in stone, visible to all, unchangeable by whim. When protesters hold signs demanding justice, they engage in a tradition that began with Babylonian citizens pointing to Hammurabi's stele and insisting that even kings must obey the written word. The city that refuses to die. In 1899, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey stood on a desolate mound called Tel Babel in the Iraqi desert, convinced that beneath his feet lay the legendary Babylon. Local Arabs thought him mad, warning that the place was cursed, that jinn haunted the ruins, that nothing good could come from disturbing the ancient dead. For the next 14 years, through sandstorms, floods, and the outbreak of World War I, Koldewey and his team would move 35 million cubic feet of earth, slowly resurrecting the city that had been lost for 2 millennia. What they found exceeded even their dreams. The foundations of the Tower of Babel, the throne room where Alexander died, and most spectacularly, the complete Ishtar Gate, its blue bricks still vivid after 500 years underground. The resurrection of Babylon created a crisis of ownership that continues today. The Germans transported the entire Ishtar Gate to Berlin, where it stands rebuilt in the Pergamon Museum, too large and too valuable to ever return. The British Museum holds 130 cuneiform tablets from Babylonian libraries, including portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Louvre displays Hammurabi's law code, that black basalt stele that founded Western legal tradition. Iraq, the modern nation, built atop ancient Mesopotamia, possesses the site, but not the treasures. This dispersal, heartbreaking as it may be for Iraqis, inadvertently saved Babylon's legacy. When looters ransacked the Iraq Museum in 2003, when ISIS destroyed archaeological sites in 2015, Babylon's artifacts remained safe in Western vaults, preserved by the same colonialism that had stolen them. You can visit Babylon today, though the journey requires armoured vehicles and military escorts through territories where ancient place names mix with modern battlefields. The site that emerges from the desert is both authentic and artificial, ancient and modern. Saddam Hussein, seeing himself as Nebuchadnezzar reborn, rebuilt portions of the ancient city in the 1980s, stamping new bricks with his name just as the ancient king had done. These reconstructions, archaeologically criminal but visually striking, create a strange palimpsest where dictators separated by 500 years collaborated on the same walls. American soldiers in 2003 built a helipad on the ancient Tel, their Chinook helicopters landing where Hammurabi had once dispensed justice. Polish forces filled sandbags with earth, containing pottery shards and cuneiform tablet fragments, inadvertently creating the world's most culturally significant military fortifications. Despite war, looting, and misguided reconstruction, Babylon refuses to die. Iraqi archaeologists, trained via Skype by British and American colleagues they cannot visit, continue excavations with mobile phones and consumer drones, replacing expensive equipment. Each season brings new discoveries, a hidden archive of medical texts, a neighborhood of Jewish exiles with Hebrew graffiti still visible on walls, evidence of Indian merchants that pushes back the date of contact between civilizations. Most poignant was the 2019 discovery of a clay tablet in what had been a school, containing a child's practice writing. "I am learning to write my name," repeated dozens of times in increasingly steady cuneiform. The name was Belushazib, the same as the scribe mentioned in tablets from 400 years later. Perhaps the child succeeded in his studies. Perhaps his name was merely common. But in that tablet lies proof that Babylon was not just a city of kings and priests, but of children learning to write, parents hoping for their futures, teachers patiently correcting backwards wedges. The modern village of Hilla spreads to the very edge of the archaeological site, its concrete houses built with bricks robbed from Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Children play soccer in fields where Alexander's soldiers once drilled. Women hang laundry on lines stretched between ancient walls. The Euphrates, which abandoned Babylon centuries ago, still flows 3 miles to the west, its waters carrying the same silt that built the first cities. At sunset, when the light turns the ruins golden and the modern city fades into shadow, you can almost see it, the Babylon that was, shimmering like a mirage. Where the Babylon that is stands, the city that touched heaven has returned to earth, but in its dust lies the DNA of every city that followed, every law court that seeks justice, every clock that marks time, every human who looks at the stars and wonders what they mean. Closing sequence. We began tonight with a paradox, a city that should never have existed, rising from salt and sand to touch the very heavens. Now, having walked through 4,000 years of Babylon's story, perhaps the greater paradox is not that it rose, but that it fell so completely and yet remains so present. Every law book opened in pursuit of justice, every astronomer calculating orbital mechanics, every person checking the time carries forward something that began between the Tigris and Euphrates. Babylon fell, was buried, was forgotten, and yet it conquered time itself. The city that crumbled to dust gave us the tools to measure eternity. When we speak, we carry Babylon in our mouths, without knowing it. The word Babel comes from Babel, that tower whose builders' tongues were confused. When something is Babylonian in scale, we mean it exceeds normal human ambition. A hanging garden still means an impossible paradise. But beyond individual words, Babylon gave us the very concept that human speech could be frozen in writing, preserved across millennia, translated between peoples who would never meet. Every book is a descendant of those first clay tablets, pressed by eager students learning to make their marks permanent. The lesson Babylon teaches is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it proves that nothing humans build is permanent, that even the greatest cities return to earth, that pride truly does come before the fall. The same river that created Babylon destroyed it. The same ambition that built the Hanging Gardens led to Belshazzar's fatal feast. The same openness that made it the world's first cosmopolitan city left it vulnerable to conquest by anyone who promised better management. Yet Babylon also inspires, because it shows that while stone crumbles and bronze corrodes, ideas are immortal. Hammurabi's palace is dust, but his concept of written law governs billions. Nebuchadnezzar's empire vanished, but the astronomy his priests practiced still guides spacecraft to distant planets. The city died, but what the city thought lives forever. It's been my privilege to walk with you through the corridors of history, to stand together in throne rooms where empires rose and fell, to witness the writing on the wall and the Tower of Babel's construction, to feel the desert wind that buried the greatest city ever built, and to see its resurrection through archaeology's patient hands. Until tomorrow's tale, may you find tranquil rest.